Is the key to success. I am teacher Rondacie, and for today I'll be doing an audio for this lesson with you. To begin with, we'll be learning something new in this lesson, which is our today we'll be doing mathematics. We'll be continuing on solid shape, but what is new is that on solid shapes, we'll be finding the net of the solid shape, the cube and the cuboid. And remember, in last class, we looked at the properties and so on. So before we get into this before we get into this lesson, remember that solid shapes are three-dimensional shapes. And for today's lesson, we'll be looking at two of those dimensional shapes, which is the cube and the cuboid. Now we get into the lesson. The first thing is, does anybody know or have heard of the word net before? If so, then that is great. That is awesome. I congratulate you for researching on this. So it says here, what is the definition of net? What is the definition of net? Teacher have a definition and she will read it to you, so it can also become your definition as well as my definition. So it says here, the net. I'll begin. The net is a two-dimensional shape that can be folded into a three-dimensional figure. That is the net of that figure. I'll read it once, I'll read it twice, I'll read it thrice. I'll read it one more time again. The net is a two-dimensional shape that can be folded into a three-dimensional figure. That is the net of that figure. I'll read it one more time so you know that, make sure everybody understand what the definition of net is. It says here, the net is a two-dimensional shape that can be folded into a three-dimensional figure. That is the net of that figure. So we have just learned the definition of the net, and now we'll go in depth about this. First, we'll begin with the cube. And we all know what the cube looks like. We said in last class that the cube has square faces. We said that the cube has 6 square faces, 12 edges, and 8 vertices. We looked at diagrams of the cube. Now, it says here that when the square faces of a cube are separated at the edges and laid out flat, they make a two-dimensional figure called the net. I'll read it again. It says here that when the square faces of a cube are separated at the edges, I remember where is the edges of the shape, where the two faces join together, there we have the edges. So it says here, when the square faces of a cube are separated at the edges and laid out flat, they make a two-dimensional figure called the net. So once the shape is laid out flat, it's called the net of that shape. So the net of the cube, when it's laid out flat, that is the net. And the net is called a two-dimensional figure. Now, remember I was saying that once it's laid out flat, as in before here, once it's laid out flat, then it's called a two-dimensional figure or shape. So on the side that you see the square faces open out, this is where it lay out flat. And where you see the cube together, that is the three-dimensional shape. So on my right, you have the three-dimensional shape, and on my left, you have the two-dimensional figure, which is the net of that figure, right? So if anybody asks you what is the net of a cube or what the net of a cube looks like, you know exactly what to show them and what to tell them. The net of a cube is laid out flat. It is always laid out flat. Okay? Good. Now we'll be moving on. So here is where it talk about what the cube is consist of, right? What it is consist of. And we said that a cube has 6 square faces, like I said before. It has 6 square faces, and if you count here, you see 6 square faces. Let us count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 square faces. The edges is where the faces join together, right? So there are 12 edges and 8 vertices. And remember, the vertices, we also know another word for vertice. We mostly call it the point or the tip, but the corrected name is vertice or vertex, right? Sometimes some shapes have only one vertex. If there's more than one, then we say vertices. And as for the cube, it has 8 vertices. So we can find 8 vertices or 8 tip, because some of us know it as tip, but remember the correct name is vertice on the cube. Now we'll be learning about the cuboid, and it says here a cuboid is similar to a cube, but some or all of its sides may be rectangular. So if you listen this one more time, it says that a cube is similar to a cuboid. Well, let me change that around. The cuboid is similar to the cube, meaning that they have some properties in common, but some or all of its sides may be rectangular. And we learned that the cube has square faces, but the cuboid has rectangular faces. The nets therefore have the same sort of characteristics as those of a cube, but they appear quite different. So I'll read this one more time. I was reading and explaining to you. So I'll read it first and then I'll explain it back one more time. So it says here that a cuboid is similar to a cube, but some or all of its sides may be rectangular. The net therefore have the same sort of characteristics as those of a cube, but they appear quite different. So here we learn that the cuboid is similar to the cube, but in this case, instead of square faces, it has rectangular faces. The net is therefore the same, but they're quite different in some ways. Here we have a diagram showing the cuboid as a 2D and a 3D shape. In this case, 2D means two-dimensional, like I mentioned before, and 3D means three-dimensional. So on one side, we see the cube as a three-dimensional. That is when it's pulled together. And on the next side, where it says net of the cuboid, this is where it's laid out flat. This is called a two-dimensional shape or two-dimensional figure. So look at it carefully and observe it. Good. Now we'll move on. So like I mentioned before that the cuboid has some things in common with the cube. As you can see here, it also says that it has 6 Sorry about that. 6 faces and also 12 edges and 8 vertices. Now we'll be moving on to the first activity, and it says here that group 1 cherry, since I'll separate the class into 3 groups. The first group, which is group 1 cherries, you will draw the net of either the cube or the cuboid and write the name at the bottom of it. I'll read that one more time so you can understand what you're doing. You are going to draw the net of either the cube or the cuboid, meaning that you will draw the cube or you can draw the cuboid. You're not drawing both shapes. You're not drawing both shapes. You're drawing one of them, one of your choice, and you write the name at the bottom. So if you draw the cube, then you write the cube's name at the bottom. If you draw the cuboid, then you write the cuboid name at the bottom. Activity for group 2 mangoes. Your activity says that you should read and say whether the question is true or false. I'll read it again. It says to read and say whether the question is true or false. So you can either circle or underline the answer to the correct question. So I read the 2 questions that you have. Your first question says, when the solid shape is on fold, it's called the net of the shape. I'll read this one more time. When the solid shape is full, it's called the net of the shape. Remember, listen to me carefully. When the solid shapes is unfold, it's called the net of the shape. True or false? You circle your answer. The second question says a cube has 6 rectangular faces. What does it say? A cube has 6 rectangular faces. I'll read that one more time. Question 2 says a cube has 6 rectangular faces. Is that true or false? Group 2, that's your activity for this lesson. Moving on. Group 3. Group 3 apple. Your activity for today is to make the net of one of the following solid shape. Your activity is to make the net of one of the following shape. What are you doing? You're making the net of one of the solid shape, either the cube or the cuboid. And remember, we said that the net of the solid shape is when it's laid out flat, so you're making something flat. Now this has brought us to the end of our lesson, and we will recap on what we did and what we learned. So first thing first, we learned that the net of a solid shape is when it's laid out flat. The net is a 2-dimensional figure or a 2-dimensional shape. We learned that the cuboid has 6 square faces. We learned that the cube has 12 edges, and we also learned that the cube has 8 vertices. We learned that the cube, when it's laid out flat, you get to see the 6 faces, you get to see the edges, and you also get to see the vertices. Good. We learned that the cube has, yes, the cube has rectangular faces. We learned that the cuboid, we learned that the cuboid has rectangular faces. We also learned that the cube have similar things in common with the cube. So the cuboid has some stuff that is similar with the cube. So this has brought us to the end of our lesson for the day. Do complete your activity. Remember, the first person, the first group, you're drawing any of these shapes and you are writing the name to the bottom. The second group, you are saying whether the question is true or false. Remember to read your question carefully, then answer to see whether it's true or false. And for the last group, we learn you will be making a net of either shape, meaning that you're making the net of the cube or you make the net of the cuboid. Alright, so do have a great afternoon. I hope you enjoy this class. I'll see you next class.